Who are these bloody civilians? Kindly find your way off this base. Those words still echo in my head like gunfire in an empty chamber. Sharp. Brutal. Designed to cut deep and leave scars. The Admiral's voice carried that particular brand of arrogance that only comes from a man drunk on his own authority, convinced that the stars on his collar made him untouchable, unquestionable, godlike. I can still see my parents standing there at the gate, frozen like deer caught in headlights. My mother, small and gentle, clutching that wicker basket she'd packed with my favorite homemade cookies and sandwiches. My father, tall and silent, his weathered hands steady despite the humiliation pouring down on them like acid rain. They'd driven 6 hours to surprise me. 6 hours through desert highways and mountain passes, talking excitedly about seeing their daughter in uniform, proud of the woman who'd earned her place among the most elite warriors in the world. And this pompous, ego-drunk fool was treating them like garbage at a military gate. "Sir, we're here to see our daughter." My mother's voice trembled, and hearing that tremor in the voice of the strongest woman I'd ever known felt like someone was twisting a knife in my chest. She was trying to maintain dignity while this man stripped it away piece by piece. He scoffed. Actually scoffed. Like the idea of them having a daughter in the Navy was some kind of cosmic joke. "Your daughter? Then she's a disgrace to the uniform." A disgrace to the uniform. Let me tell you what those words did to me. They didn't just sting, they burned through every layer of pride, every hard-earned medal, every sleepless night I'd spent proving I belonged here. They reached into my soul and twisted everything I'd worked for into something ugly and shameful. I stood there in my dress blues, the same uniform I'd worn with honor through 3 deployments, through missions that would make most people wake up screaming. The same uniform that had been blessed by the blood, sweat, and tears of every woman who'd fought to earn the right to wear it. And this man, this absolute disgrace of a leader, was calling me worthless. My fists clenched so tight I could feel my nails cutting into my palms. My throat burned with words I couldn't say, responses I couldn't give, because military protocol had me in chains. I couldn't defend my parents. I couldn't defend myself. I couldn't do anything but stand there and watch the 2 people who'd raised me to believe in honor and integrity get humiliated by a man who understood neither. I said nothing. I couldn't. The uniform that was supposed to represent everything noble and brave had become a prison, and my silence felt like betrayal. But 20 minutes later, just 20 minutes later, that same Admiral was running across the base like his life depended on it. Running. An Admiral. Sweating through his perfectly pressed uniform, shouting at subordinates, desperately trying to find the very people he had mocked and dismissed. Because one phone call had just revealed who my father really was. Before I tell you what that call revealed, I need you to understand something. I need you to feel the weight of what happened that day, because this isn't just about military rank or family honor. This is about the moment when arrogance meets reality, when assumptions collide with truth, and when the quiet dignity of real strength shows itself against the loud bluster of fake power. Hit that like button if you're ready to hear how respect doesn't come from the stars on your collar, but from the character in your heart. Subscribe because this story will remind you that real authority isn't earned through intimidation, it's built through integrity. And comment where you're watching from, because I want to know that this message is reaching people who understand that sometimes the most powerful moments happen when the powerful realize they're not. Let me take you back to the beginning. Before the humiliation, before the rage, before everything fell apart and came back together in ways none of us could have predicted. I wasn't always angry. There was a time when wearing this uniform felt like wearing a piece of heaven. When every morning I'd wake up knowing I was part of something bigger than myself, something that mattered beyond my own small world. I earned my place here the hard way. While other women my age were figuring out their careers or starting families, I was crawling through mud in training exercises that were designed to break the strongest men. I was learning to shoot with precision that could save lives or take them, studying tactics that would determine the success or failure of missions that most civilians would never even know existed. The numbers don't lie, and they sure as hell don't care about feelings. Less than 1% of Navy personnel ever make it through SEAL training. Less than that are women. I wasn't just rare, I was practically mythical. Every day I wore this uniform was a testament to pushing past limitations that other people assumed were permanent. But it wasn't the statistics that kept me going through the hell of training. It wasn't the prestige, or the respect, or the knowledge that I was breaking barriers. It was the weight of my father's dog tag against my chest, the one I'd worn through every mission, every exercise, every moment when I thought I couldn't take another step. My father raised me with discipline that could cut glass and silence that spoke louder than most people's speeches. He never told me I was special or different or destined for greatness. He just expected excellence, quietly and consistently, the way some people expect the sun to rise. When I scraped my knee as a child, he'd hand me a bandage and tell me to walk it off. When I failed a test in school, he'd sit me down at the kitchen table and watch me study until I understood not just the answers, but why they mattered. He taught me that strength isn't about being the loudest person in the room. It's about being the calmest. It's about holding your ground when everyone else is shaking, speaking truth when everyone else is hiding behind comfortable lies, and standing for principles even when those principles cost you something. The dog tag I wore belonged to him, worn smooth from decades of his thumb rubbing across it during moments of stress or contemplation. It was issued to him when he was barely 18, shipped off to a war most people prefer to forget, where he learned lessons about honor and sacrifice that he carried for the rest of his life. He never talked about that war, never bragged about his service, never used his military experience to win arguments or gain sympathy. But I knew. Children always know when their parents have seen things that change them forever. My mother, God bless her gentle heart, was his perfect complement. Where he was steel, she was silk. Where he was silence, she was soft words that could heal wounds you didn't even know you had. She worried about me constantly, not because she didn't believe in my abilities, but because she understood the cost of the life I'd chosen. Wear the uniform without losing your heart, she'd tell me before every deployment, her hands smoothing down my collar with the same care she'd used to comfort me through childhood nightmares. Come home with your honor intact, but come home with your soul intact too. She knew what military life could do to people. She'd seen it happen to my father, not broken, never broken, but changed in ways that carved permanent shadows behind his eyes. She prayed every night that I'd be strong enough to serve with distinction and wise enough to remember that the uniform was something I wore, not something I was. This visit was supposed to be different. This was supposed to be one of those perfect moments that military families dream about, when service and family intersect in something beautiful instead of painful. They'd driven 6 hours to surprise me during a brief shore leave, bringing homemade food and parental pride and the kind of unconditional love that doesn't depend on rank or recognition. I'd been looking forward to showing them around the base, introducing them to my fellow SEALs, letting them see firsthand what their daughter had accomplished. I wanted my father to see that his lessons had taken root, that the discipline he'd taught me had grown into something that could serve others. I wanted my mother to see that I hadn't lost my heart in the process of finding my strength. Instead, they got Admiral Hensley. Admiral Marcus Hensley. Even his name tastes bitter in my mouth. He was the kind of officer who confused authority with authoritarianism, who believed that respect was something you demanded rather than earned. He'd never seen real combat. His entire career had been built on political maneuvering and administrative power plays that kept him safely behind desks, while better soldiers bled in places he couldn't pronounce. But he wore those stars like they made him immortal, like they gave him the right to treat human beings as obstacles to his convenience. He was known throughout the command for his explosive temper, his complete lack of empathy, and his particular talent for humiliating people in public as a way of asserting dominance. The base entry point was his hunting ground. He'd position himself there during visiting hours, looking for any excuse to flex his authority on families and friends who didn't understand military protocol. It was a sick game to him. Watching civilian relatives fumble through security procedures they weren't familiar with, then swooping in to make them feel small and unwelcome. My parents never stood a chance. They'd arrived at the gate during the afternoon shift change, when security was already heightened and patience was running thin. The guards were doing their job, checking IDs, verifying visitor status, following procedures that existed for everyone's safety. My parents were cooperating completely, answering questions politely, waiting patiently for clearance. That's when he spotted them. I wasn't there for the initial confrontation, but I heard about it within minutes. The entire base communication network was buzzing with the story. Word travels fast in military communities, especially when it involves someone in command making a spectacle of themselves. He'd approached the gate like a storm front moving in, all dark energy and barely contained violence. The guards snapped to attention, recognizing the approaching hurricane but powerless to redirect it. My parents, still focused on completing their paperwork, didn't even see him coming. Who are these bloody civilians? The force of his voice stopped conversations 50 yards away. Other visiting families turned to stare. Guards shifted uncomfortably, caught between protocol and the sinking feeling that they were about to witness something terrible. Kindly find your way off this base. Kindly. He used the word kindly like a weapon, dripping with sarcasm and contempt, making it clear that there was nothing kind about his request, that it was a command dressed up as politeness to make his cruelty seem civilized. My parents froze. My mother's hands tightened on the basket she'd packed with such care and love. My father's expression went completely neutral, the same look he'd worn when dealing with difficult people throughout my childhood, a mask of calm that hid whatever storm might be brewing underneath. "Sir," my mother said, and I can only imagine how much strength it took for her to keep her voice steady, "we're here to see our daughter." He scoffed. That sound, that dismissive, contemptuous noise, cut through me when I heard about it later, like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart until it stopped beating. "Your daughter." He said it like the concept was absurd, like the idea of my parents having a child in the military was some kind of cosmic joke. "Then she's a disgrace to the uniform." A disgrace to the uniform. When those words reached me 20 minutes later, carried by a fellow SEAL who'd witnessed the whole thing, I felt something break inside my chest. Not break like damage, break like a dam bursting, releasing years of controlled anger and frustration and pain that I'd kept locked away in the name of military discipline. A disgrace to the uniform. This from a man who'd never earned a single medal through courage, who'd never put his life on the line for anything more dangerous than a budget meeting, who'd never understood that the uniform doesn't make the soldier makes the uniform sacred. I'd earned my place through blood and sweat and determination that most people couldn't comprehend. I'd proven myself in training exercises that broke stronger candidates, in missions that required split-second decisions with life-or-death consequences, in situations where failure meant not just personal defeat, but the loss of brothers and sisters who depended on my skills for their survival. And this desk jockey, this political appointee, this waste of oxygen in an admiral's uniform was calling me a disgrace while humiliating the two people who'd raised me to understand what honor actually meant. By the time I reached the gate, my parents were already walking away. I could see them in the distance, my father's arm around my mother's shoulders, their pace steady and dignified despite the humiliation they'd just endured. The basket of food my mother had prepared was still in her hands, and seeing that basket, knowing it contained cookies she'd baked at 5 a.m. because she wanted everything to be perfect for our surprise reunion, made me want to scream. Admiral Hensley was still there, basking in the aftermath of his power display. He was talking to the guards about maintaining base security and keeping standards high, as if terrorizing visiting families was somehow related to national defense. When he saw me approaching, his eyes lit up with predatory satisfaction. He'd been waiting for this moment, the chance to extend his humiliation from my parents to me directly. He said, loud enough for everyone in the area to hear, the soldier whose family doesn't understand military protocol. Every eye at that gate turned to me. Guards who'd seen me in action, who knew my reputation and respected my skills, suddenly couldn't meet my gaze. Other personnel found urgent business elsewhere. The weight of their discomfort and embarrassment pressed down on me like atmosphere at the bottom of the ocean. I stood at attention because that's what protocol demanded. I kept my expression neutral because that's what military discipline required. I said nothing because speaking out against a superior officer would have ended my career and dishonored everything my father had taught me about choosing battles carefully. But inside, I was burning alive. Your parents, he continued, clearly enjoying the audience he'd gathered, seemed to think they could waltz onto this base without understanding proper procedures. Perhaps you need to educate them about respect for military authority. Respect for military authority. From a man who'd never earned the authority he wielded, who used his rank as a club to beat down people who couldn't fight back, who confused fear with respect and intimidation with leadership. The irony was so thick I could taste it. My parents understood military authority better than he ever would. They understood that real authority comes from service, from sacrifice, from earning the trust and loyalty of the people you lead. They understood that a uniform is only as honorable as the person wearing it, and that rank without character is just costume jewelry. I wanted to tell him that my father had forgotten more about military honor than he'd ever learn. I wanted to explain that my mother's prayers had protected more soldiers than his policies ever would. I wanted to make him understand that he was a disgrace to everything the uniform was supposed to represent. Instead, I said nothing. The silence stretched between us like a bridge over hell. He was waiting for me to break, to give him an excuse to destroy my career right there in front of everyone. I could feel his anticipation, his desire to complete the humiliation he'd started with my parents by finishing it with me. But my father's voice echoed in my memory, "Stay calm. Never speak when anger is doing the talking. Let respect handle disrespect." So I stayed silent. I endured his smug satisfaction and the uncomfortable stares of my colleagues and the burning shame of not being able to defend the people I loved most in the world. I swallowed my rage and my pain and my desperate need for justice, and I waited. Because my father had taught me that patience isn't weakness, it's preparation. And sometimes, just sometimes, patience gets rewarded in ways you never could have planned. The aftermath of public humiliation in a military setting is like poison spreading through water. It doesn't just affect you, it contaminates everything around you, changes how people look at you, how they interact with you, how they think about you when you're not around. Within an hour, the story had spread through the entire base. Not because people were gossiping out of malice, but because what had happened was so shocking, so unprecedented, that it demanded to be talked about. An admiral publicly humiliating visiting family members wasn't just unprofessional, it was a violation of everything the military was supposed to stand for. But here's the thing about military culture. It's built on hierarchy and obedience, which means that even when everyone knows something is wrong, challenging it directly requires more courage than most people possess. So instead of outrage, I got sympathy. Instead of support, I got awkward silences and averted eyes. My fellow SEALs didn't know what to say to me. These were men and women who'd trust me with their lives in combat, who'd seen me perform under pressure that would break most people, who knew my capabilities and respected my skills. But facing an admiral's abuse of power? That was a different kind of battlefield, one where their usual courage felt inadequate. That was fucked up, Martinez told me quietly as we passed in the corridor. That was really fucked up. But that's all he could say. That's all any of them could say. Because speaking out against an admiral meant risking their own careers, their own futures, their own ability to serve and provide for their families. The system that was supposed to protect us had created a situation where protecting me meant sacrificing themselves. I understood their silence. I didn't like it, but I understood it. The military runs on chains of command for good reasons. In combat, hesitation kills people, and questioning orders at the wrong moment can turn victory into disaster. But that same system that kept us alive in war zones could be used as a weapon against us in peacetime. I sat in the empty barracks that evening, staring at the ribbons and medals on my dress uniform hanging in the locker. Purple Heart, Bronze Star, Navy Cross. Each one represented a moment when I'd put everything on the line for something bigger than myself. Each one was earned through blood, through pain, through choices that required me to be stronger and braver and more disciplined than I'd ever thought possible. But what did they mean if the institution that awarded them could allow someone like Admiral Hensley to represent its values? What did any of it mean if good soldiers could be humiliated and good families could be degraded and good people could be powerless to stop it? My phone buzzed with a text message from my father. Just a few words, but they carried the weight of his entire philosophy. Stay calm. Never speak. Let respect handle disrespect. Stay calm. In the face of injustice that made me want to scream until my throat bled, stay calm. Never speak. When every instinct demanded that I defend my honor and my family's dignity, remain silent. Let respect handle disrespect. Trust that somehow, somewhere, the universe would balance the scales without requiring me to destroy my own career in the process. Easy words to read. Impossible advice to follow when your soul is on fire and your sense of justice is screaming for action. But my father had never given me easy advice. He'd always given me right advice, even when right felt impossible. So I stayed calm. I kept my mouth shut. And I waited for respect to handle disrespect, even though I had no idea what that would look like or how it could possibly happen. The base felt different that night. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. People who normally sought out my company found reasons to be elsewhere. Not because they blamed me for what had happened, but because my presence reminded them of their own powerlessness, their own inability to stand up for what was right when the cost felt too high. I'd become a living symbol of everything that was broken about the system we'd all sworn to serve. Nobody wanted to look at that symbol too closely, because seeing it clearly meant acknowledging truths that were too painful to face. But in the quiet of that empty barracks, surrounded by the ghosts of better days and the weight of an uncertain future, I made myself a promise. Whatever happened next, however this played out, I would not let Admiral Hensley's cruelty define my service or diminish my understanding of what the uniform was supposed to represent. I would not let his darkness put out the light my parents had taught me to carry, even if I had to carry it alone. 24 hours passed like 24 years. Every minute dragged with the weight of unresolved injustice, every hour stretched with the tension of waiting for consequences that might never come. I went through the motions of my duties, training exercises, equipment maintenance, briefings that felt surreal given what had happened, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. Admiral Hensley, meanwhile, was basking in what he saw as a successful demonstration of his authority. Word filtered back through the ranks that he was actually bragging about the incident, describing it as an example of maintaining proper base security and keeping civilian interference to a minimum. He'd turned my family's humiliation into a talking point for his leadership philosophy. That knowledge sat in my stomach like acid, burning through every attempt at professional composure I tried to maintain. But my father's words kept echoing. Let respect handle disrespect. I was beginning to think that respect was taking its sweet time. The afternoon of the second day, I was in the equipment bay running routine maintenance on communication gear when I heard shouting from the direction of the command building. Not the usual sharp bark of military orders, but something different, something that sounded almost like panic. Through the windows, I could see Admiral Hensley's aide running across the courtyard, moving faster than military bearing usually allowed. Behind him, other personnel were emerging from buildings, drawn by the commotion but clearly uncertain about what they were witnessing. Then I saw him. Admiral Hensley himself, bursting through the doors of the command building like a man whose life depended on speed. His usually perfect uniform was disheveled, his face flushed red with exertion and what looked suspiciously like fear. He was shouting orders at subordinates, demanding information, frantically searching for something or someone. For a moment, I thought there might be some kind of emergency, a security threat, a medical crisis, something that would justify the chaos I was witnessing. But as his words became clearer, as the purpose of his frantic activity became apparent, I realized what was happening. He was looking for my parents. The same parents he'd humiliated and dismissed 24 hours earlier were now the subject of the most intensive search operation the base had seen in months. Guards were checking gate logs, personnel were making phone calls, and Admiral Hensley was coordinating it all with the desperate energy of a man who'd just realized he'd made a catastrophic mistake. I stepped out of the equipment bay, moving closer to the action while trying to remain inconspicuous. Other personnel were doing the same thing, drawn by curiosity, but afraid to get too close to whatever storm was brewing around our commanding officer. That's when I heard the conversation that explained everything. "Sir," one of his aides was saying, slightly out of breath from running, "we've checked all the local hotels. No one by that name has checked in. Keep looking." Hensley barked, his voice carrying a note of hysteria I'd never heard from him before. "Check restaurants, gas stations, anywhere they might have stopped. We need to find them before." He stopped mid-sentence, suddenly aware of the audience he'd gathered. For the first time since I'd known him, Admiral Marcus Hensley looked genuinely afraid. That's when I understood. Somewhere in the previous 24 hours, someone had explained to Admiral Hensley exactly who he'd thrown off the base. Someone had made him understand that the couple he'd humiliated weren't just random civilians visiting their daughter. They were people whose names carried weight in military circles, people whose treatment would reflect directly on his leadership and his career. Someone had told him who my father really was. I felt a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth, the first genuine expression of happiness I'd felt since this whole nightmare began. Not because I enjoyed seeing another person in distress, but because justice was finally beginning to show its face. "Admiral Hensley," I said, stepping forward from the small crowd that had gathered. My voice was calm, controlled, everything his was not. "You're looking for my parents?" He spun toward me, and for a moment I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before, genuine fear. Not the theatrical anger he used to intimidate subordinates, not the calculated cruelty he employed to maintain dominance, but real, honest terror at the realization that his actions might have consequences he hadn't considered. "You," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word. "Where are they?" "Where did they go?" "They left," I replied simply. "After you told them they weren't welcome here, they left." The truth of those words hung in the air between us like a sword. He'd told them to leave, and they had. He'd made it clear they weren't welcome, and they'd respected his authority. They'd done exactly what he demanded, and now he was desperate to undo what couldn't be undone. There was a misunderstanding, he began, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "I need to speak with them, to clarify." "To clarify what?" I interrupted, and my calm tone made the question cut deeper than shouting would have. "To clarify that you think my family doesn't understand military protocol? To clarify that you believe I'm a disgrace to this uniform?" The personnel around us had gone completely silent. Even the most junior enlisted soldiers could sense that something significant was happening, that the usual power dynamics of the base were shifting in ways they'd never seen before. Admiral Hensley's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. For the first time in our interaction, he had no ready answer, no quick comeback, no way to reassert his authority through intimidation or ridicule. Because now he knew. Now he understood who my father was, what his service record contained, why his name commanded respect in circles that Admiral Hensley could only dream of accessing. Now he realized that the quiet man he dismissed as just another civilian was someone whose opinion could end careers, whose approval was sought by officers far more distinguished than himself. Now he was afraid. Let me tell you about the phone call that changed everything. Because while I was watching Admiral Hensley panic in the courtyard, I didn't yet know the details of what had triggered his transformation from arrogant bully to terrified supplicant. It had happened an hour earlier, while he was in his office reviewing reports and probably still congratulating himself on his handling of the civilian interference situation. His secure line had rung the red phone that connected directly to Naval Command, the one that carried orders and information that could reshape careers with a single conversation. He'd answered with his usual confidence, expecting routine communication about logistics or personnel assignments. Instead, he'd found himself talking to someone whose authority made his own seem as insignificant as a child's toy badge. Admiral Hensley, the voice on the other end had said, low and steady and carrying the weight of absolute command, "Is it true you stopped a couple named Callahan from entering your base yesterday?" "Yes, sir," he'd replied, still smugly confident in his decision. Security protocols were properly. "Admiral," the voice had interrupted, and the single word carried enough ice to freeze a man's blood. "You've just disrespected Rear Admiral James Callahan, retired, decorated, and your superior in 2 wars. The silence that followed that statement must have felt like falling into an abyss. Everything Admiral Hensley thought he knew about the situation, every assumption he'd made about his authority and his right to treat my parents as he had, crumbled in the space between heartbeats. Rear Admiral James Callahan. My father. The man who'd raised me to understand that true strength was quiet, that real authority was earned through service rather than demanded through intimidation, that honor was something you carried inside rather than something you wore on your sleeve. The man Admiral Hensley had just humiliated in front of an entire military installation. "Sir," Admiral Hensley had managed, his voice already beginning to shake with the realization of what he'd done, "I wasn't aware of Admiral Callahan's identity." The visitors didn't identify themselves as. They shouldn't have had to. The voice had cut him off. Every military family deserves basic respect and courtesy. But Admiral Callahan's service record includes 2 Purple Hearts, a Navy Cross, and classified operations that shaped naval strategy for the past 3 decades. He's a personal friend of the Secretary of the Navy and a mentor to half the flag officers currently serving. With each word, Admiral Hensley's career had crumbled a little more. Not just because he'd unknowingly insulted someone with connections and influence, but because those connections meant his actions would be scrutinized by people who actually understood military honor and leadership. Furthermore, the voice had continued, Admiral Callahan's daughter is one of the most decorated SEALs in active service. Her performance record is exemplary. Her conduct is beyond reproach, and calling her a disgrace to the uniform demonstrates a level of poor judgment that raises serious questions about your fitness for command. That's when Admiral Hensley had realized the full scope of his mistake. He hadn't just insulted some random civilians, he'd publicly humiliated a military family whose service and sacrifice embodied everything the Navy claimed to value. He'd attacked the integrity of a decorated SEAL based on nothing more than his own arrogance and prejudice. And now people who actually mattered were going to hear about it. "I need those individuals located immediately," the voice had commanded. "A formal apology will be issued from this command, and Admiral Callahan will be extended every courtesy due his rank and service. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir." "Absolutely, sir. I'll locate them immediately and..." The line had gone dead, leaving Admiral Hensley alone with the magnitude of his error and the certainty that his career was about to face scrutiny he was utterly unprepared for. That's what had sent him running through the base like a man whose life depended on finding my parents before word of his mistake reached the wrong ears. Or rather, before it reached more of the wrong ears than it already had. But my parents were gone. They'd driven those 6 hours back home, carrying with them the memory of my father's service being dismissed and my honor being questioned. They'd left believing that the military they'd devoted their lives to serving had changed into something they no longer recognized. And that broke my heart more than anything Admiral Hensley had said about me. Standing in that courtyard, watching him frantically orchestrate a search for people who were already halfway home, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice was finally showing its face, but it had come too late to undo the damage that had been done. "You asked who they were, sir," I said quietly, stepping closer to Admiral Hensley as his aides scattered to continue their futile search. "Now you know." He looked at me with something approaching desperation. "Your father, Admiral Callahan. I need to speak with him." There was a misunderstanding. "There was no misunderstanding," I interrupted, my voice still calm but carrying steel underneath. "You saw 2 civilians at the gate and decided to flex your authority. You made assumptions about people you knew nothing about, treated them with contempt, and used your rank to humiliate them in public. The only thing you didn't understand was that there might be consequences." The truth of my words settled around us like dust after an explosion. Other personnel were still watching, still listening, still trying to process the unprecedented sight of their commanding officer being held accountable by a subordinate. But I wasn't speaking as a subordinate anymore. I was speaking as the daughter of a man whose service had earned him the right to respect, as a SEAL whose record spoke for itself, as someone who finally understood what my father had meant when he said, "Let respect handle disrespect." Respect had finally arrived. It was late, and it couldn't undo the damage that had been done, but it was here. Admiral Hensley's phone rang again, the same red line that had started this whole chain of events. He answered it with trembling hands, and I could hear the voice on the other end clearly enough to understand that his day was about to get much worse. "Admiral Hensley, you're relieved of command pending a full investigation into your conduct. Report to Naval Command for reassignment immediately." The phone slipped from his hands, clattering on the concrete at our feet. Around us, the base had gone completely silent. Even the normal sounds of military life, vehicles moving, equipment operating, personnel going about their duties, seemed to have paused in recognition of this moment. Admiral Marcus Hensley, the man who'd built his career on intimidating people who couldn't fight back, had finally encountered a force he couldn't bully or dismiss or humiliate into submission. He'd encountered accountability. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Naval Command doesn't mess around when it comes to conduct that reflects poorly on the service, especially when that conduct involves the public humiliation of a decorated military family. Within a week, Admiral Hensley's entire command history was under review. Stories emerged from other personnel about his pattern of bullying behavior, his abuse of authority, his tendency to use his rank as a weapon against anyone he perceived as vulnerable. What had happened to my family wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the most visible example of leadership failures that had been ignored for far too long. The formal apology came from Naval Command itself, not from Admiral Hensley. A written statement acknowledging that my family had been treated with inexcusable disrespect, that their treatment violated every principle the Navy claimed to uphold, and that steps were being taken to ensure such incidents never happened again. It was professional, comprehensive, and completely inadequate to address the pain that had been caused. But it was something. It was official recognition that what had happened was wrong, that my family deserved better, that the uniform I wore still meant something even when the people wearing it forgot what it was supposed to represent. Admiral Hensley was transferred to a desk job in logistics, effectively ending any hope he might have had for further advancement. His replacement was a career officer whose reputation was built on competence and integrity rather than intimidation and politics. The base began to feel different almost immediately. Personnel who'd been walking on eggshells for months started to relax. The atmosphere of fear and resentment that had characterized Admiral Hensley's leadership began to dissipate, replaced by something that felt more like what military service was supposed to be about. But the damage to my family had already been done. My father, true to his character, never spoke about the incident directly. When I called to apologize for what had happened, he simply said, "A soldier is responsible for their own conduct, not for the conduct of others. You have nothing to apologize for." My mother was less diplomatic. "That man was a disgrace," she said, her voice carrying an anger I'd rarely heard from her. Not to the uniform, to humanity. They never visited the base again. Not because they weren't welcome. The new commanding officer had personally extended an invitation for them to return anytime they wanted. But because the memory of that humiliation had tainted the place for them, turned what should have been a source of pride into a reminder of pain. That loss, the loss of my parents' connection to my military life, hurt more than anything Admiral Hensley had said about me personally. He'd stolen something precious from our family, something that couldn't be restored by investigations or apologies or career consequences. He'd stolen their faith in the institution their daughter served. 6 months later, I was promoted to Senior Chief Petty Officer. It was a recognition of my performance and leadership that should have been purely celebratory, but it was complicated by everything that had happened. The promotion came with a personal note from the Secretary of the Navy, acknowledging my family's service and expressing regret for the treatment they'd received. It was a nice gesture. It was also a reminder that justice, when it finally arrives, often comes too late to heal the wounds that were inflicted while it was absent. I pinned on my new rank in a small ceremony attended by my fellow SEALs and the new commanding officer. My parents weren't there. They'd been invited, of course, but the drive felt too long and the memories too fresh for them to make the trip. So I stood there in dress blues, accepting congratulations and praise for achievements that felt hollow without the people who'd made them possible. The ribbons and medals on my chest represented courage and sacrifice and dedication, but they couldn't represent the cost that had been paid by the family who'd raised me to understand what those qualities meant. After the ceremony, I walked alone to the same gate where Admiral Hensley had humiliated my parents. The guards on duty snapped to attention when they recognized me, their salutes sharp and respectful. They'd heard the stories, knew what had happened, understood the significance of my presence there. I stood where my parents had stood, looking out at the road they'd traveled to surprise their daughter with a visit that became a nightmare instead of a celebration. I tried to imagine what they'd felt in that moment when authority turned cruel, when service became self-serving, when the institution they'd trusted to protect their daughter turned against them instead. The wind carried the sound of military life continuing around me, vehicles moving, personnel training, the constant activity of people dedicated to something larger than themselves. It was the same sound my parents had heard while they were being humiliated, the same backdrop that had witnessed their dignity being stripped away by someone who'd confused power with strength. But it was also the sound of better leadership taking hold, of systems working the way they were supposed to work, of accountability finally catching up with behavior that had been tolerated for too long. Justice had been served, eventually. The system had corrected itself slowly. The wrong had been acknowledged, officially. But my parents were still 6 hours away, still carrying the memory of being treated as unwelcome intruders in a place where their daughter served with honor. Admiral Hensley's career had ended in disgrace, but their faith in military values had ended with it. Some victories taste bitter even when they're complete. Here's what I learned from Admiral Hensley's mistake, from my parents' humiliation, from the long process of watching justice work its way through a system designed to protect the very behavior it eventually punished. Rank doesn't define power. Character does. Admiral Hensley wore his stars like armor, used his position like a weapon, treated his authority like a divine right that exempted him from basic human decency. But when real power finally showed up, the power of integrity, the power of earned respect, the power of service that had been tested under fire, his manufactured authority crumbled like wet paper. My father never raised his voice during that encounter at the gate. He never demanded special treatment, never mentioned his own service record, never tried to use his background to intimidate or impress. He simply stood there with quiet dignity while someone smaller than him tried to make him feel small. That's real strength. That's actual power. Not the loud, desperate need to dominate that drove Admiral Hensley's behavior, but the calm confidence that comes from knowing who you are and what you've done and why it matters. The quiet ones always have the loudest power. My father taught me that lesson through 20 years of example, and Admiral Hensley proved it through one moment of spectacular failure. All his shouting and posturing and theatrical displays of authority couldn't stand against the simple, steady force of a man who'd earned his respect through service rather than demanded it through intimidation. When the phone call came that revealed who my father really was, Admiral Hensley discovered that real authority doesn't announce itself with volume. It doesn't need to. It speaks softly because it knows people will listen. It moves quietly because it knows its footsteps carry weight. The loudest person in the room is usually the weakest. The one who feels the most need to prove their power is usually the one who has the least of it to spare. Admiral Hensley spent his career building a reputation based on fear and submission. He confused obedience with respect, compliance with admiration, silence with agreement. He never understood that true leadership earns loyalty rather than demanding it, inspires excellence rather than threatening consequences, builds people up rather than tearing them down. When he encountered my parents, people who understood what military service actually meant, who'd lived its values rather than just wearing its symbols, his hollow authority was exposed for what it really was. The desperate performance of someone who'd confused the costume with the character it was supposed to represent. But here's the part of this story that matters most, the lesson that goes beyond military rank and family honor and the eventual triumph of justice over abuse. Respect doesn't come from the stars on your collar. It comes from the roots in your soul. My father's power didn't come from his rank or his record or his connections, though he had all of those in abundance. It came from the way he'd chosen to live every day of his life since he'd first put on a uniform as an 18-year-old kid who didn't know what honor meant but was willing to learn. It came from the quiet consistency of choosing principle over convenience, integrity over advantage, service over self-interest. It came from decades of small decisions that built a reputation one interaction at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of character at a time. Admiral Hensley's weakness didn't come from lacking those things, it came from actively choosing their opposites. He'd built his career on shortcuts and politics and the kind of leadership that prioritizes personal advancement over mission accomplishment. He'd forgotten that military service is supposed to be about something bigger than individual ambition. When those two philosophies collided at a base gate on an ordinary afternoon, the outcome was never really in doubt. It just took 20 minutes for the universe to deliver the results. The story spread through military circles because it represented something people needed to believe was still true, that character matters more than position, that integrity is power even when it seems powerless, that treating people with dignity is never a mistake even when treating them with contempt seems easier. My parents drove home that day carrying disappointment and hurt, but they also carried something else, the knowledge that they'd represented their values with grace under pressure, that they'd shown their daughter what real strength looks like, that they'd handled disrespect with respect even when it cost them. Admiral Hensley ran across a base in panic and desperation, trying to undo the consequences of his own choices, finally understanding that authority without character is just noise waiting to be silenced by someone who actually deserves to be heard. The uniform I wear carries the weight of everyone who's worn it before me and everyone who'll wear it after. It represents sacrifice and service and the willingness to put something bigger than yourself ahead of your own comfort and safety. But it only means something when the person wearing it understands that the cloth doesn't make them special, their choices do. Admiral Hensley forgot that lesson, if he ever learned it at all. My parents never forgot it, even when someone tried to make them feel like their understanding of military values was somehow inadequate. That's why respect handled disrespect, eventually. Because respect is patient and disrespect is not. Respect builds slowly and lasts forever. Disrespect burns bright and burns out fast. My father taught me to trust that process, to believe that character wins in the long run even when it seems to be losing in the short term. Admiral Hensley proved him right, spectacularly and permanently. Today, I still wear the same dog tag my father carried through his own service. It's even more worn now, smoothed by my own thumb during moments of stress or decision or doubt. When I touch it, I remember what real authority looks like and where authentic power comes from. I remember that the quiet ones always have the loudest power. I remember that respect doesn't come from rank, it comes from roots. I remember that Admiral Hensley's mistake wasn't just treating my family with contempt, it was forgetting that the uniform is only as honorable as the person wearing it, and honor is only as strong as the character that supports it. The base feels different now. Leadership that inspires instead of intimidating, authority that earns instead of demanding, power that builds instead of breaking. It's what military service is supposed to be about, what my parents always believed it was about, what I'm proud to be part of when it works the way it's supposed to work. But I also remember the cost of Admiral Hensley's failure, not just to his own career, but to my family's faith in the institution I serve. Some damages can't be undone by investigations or apologies or even justice served appropriately. Some wounds heal with scars that remind you why character matters more than rank, why integrity is more powerful than authority, why the quiet strength my parents taught me will always be louder than the desperate noise of people who mistake position for power. If you've ever been looked down on because of who you are or where you come from, remember this. Respect doesn't come from the stars on your collar, it comes from the roots in your soul. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, subscribe for more stories about the real meaning of courage and strength, and never forget, the quiet ones always have the loudest power. Admiral Hensley learned that lesson too late to save his career. Don't let anyone make you learn it too late to save your dignity. The uniform is only as honorable as the person wearing it. Make sure you're worthy of the cloth.